You know, we must have been really young, maybe like in toddlerhood when we first met. There's only 21 there, so. I tell you, there's nothing I like better than sitting down talking about history, especially my history, Black history. The reason is because Black history in this area is so connected. And Karen and I were just talking about how we are connected and didn't really realize it. So if you notice this picture up here of this road, you know, a dirt road leads to many paths, leads to many destinations. And so mine started really in Merrifield, but it was created through my great-great-grandfather in Delaplane in Baltimore. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Merrifield, but I'm also going to talk about Delaplane and how Karen and I are connected, and hopefully that will bring an enlightenment into more history about Faulkner County African-American community. So Merrifield, if you know where Fairfax Hospital is on Gallows Road, that's the Merrifield area. And I don't know if you've ever heard of First Baptist Church of Merrifield. That was all a Black community when I was growing up. It was, you know, dairy farms, Black folks lived there. But now, if you go to the next slide, now it's called the Mosaic. So it started out being Mills Crossroads, then it changed to Merrifield, and now it's the wonderful destination called the Mosaic District, where you can get fine dining, great places to shop, and have all the activities that you want. But the one thing that they don't have is the history of the African Americans that helped create that community. That is why I wrote this book about the lost Black communities of Merrifield, Pines and Williamstown. I got tired of people saying, Black people lived here? As a matter of fact, yes, and we helped to really create this community. So, Merrifield, let's see how many 21. Okay, so Merrifield, before it was Merrifield, was just owned field. It was owned by Charles Lee, who was the uncle of Robert Lee. And there was no plantation on it in this particular area, it was just open field. When Charles died, his widow was given 403 acres of land, which is now what we consider Merrifield, right? And so upon her remarriage, she married Mr. Glassell, and through marriage, she then gave the ownership of that 403 acres to her husband as her law. The land never was really developed. When the Civil War comes, she died, Glassell's died, and it's now in a trustee. And so the land then after the Civil War is up for sale. So what happens is freedmen are able to buy land in Merrifield. And these are three of the ones: Joshua Ball, 1876, Nimrod Dixon, 1876, and Horace Dixon in 1878. So this is what Merrifield looked like in 1960 when I was born. So you notice the other picture I showed you about the mosaic. Well, this is what it looked like an aerial view when I was growing up. In the African-American community, we, there's an area, that's where my land was, right next to the church, so God knows I'm in the church every Sunday. And then across the street was the colored school that actually my grandmother and my mother attended. It was a one-room schoolhouse that only went to the 7th grade. And it was right off of Dallas Road and Porter Road. Porter Road is going to be interesting because there's a man by the name of Robert Porter. And this is how you see a lot of African Americans obtaining property in this Merrifield area. Robert Porter was an officer in the Union, and after the Civil War, he decided that land was really, or found out land was really cheap in Fairfax County because he had decimated the soil through trying to be greedy and make a lot of money off tobacco. So they didn't know Fairfax how to really cultivate and bring nutrients back to the soil. And so Northerners like Robert Porter, who came from New York and joined the Union Army, was able to buy 300 plus acres of land in what was Mary Glasgow's land that was in trusteeship. And from that acreage that he bought, he started selling it to African Americans. Now, the whites in Merrifield that were still there after the Civil War, they weren't going to sell land to blacks, right? But these Northerners who had been Union officers come down here, purchase this land, and then they start selling it to African Americans. I call it the first flip. Right? They're buying this property and they're flipping it to African Americans. And that is his house on Gallows Road. And I don't know, do any of you know where Gallows Road is? Yeah, you know, they always say Gallows Road is Gallows Road because of one, I'm going to say it's haunted. The second, they said that was because they would take soldiers down Gallows Road and hang them. I've not found any history that really says that's true. Other historians have, but I think it's kind of neat. Why would you name a road Gallows if it's not a gallows, right? A road changes to Gallows. Doesn't make sense. So this is a map of 1894, and this is what Mills Crossroads, which then became Merrifield, looked like. And where I have the red boxes, that's where the African Americans lived. And that aerial photo that I showed you, that's where I live. So you've got the Turners who have 5 acres, Bradley has 4.5. You've got a colored school there. You've got John Coates. You've got a Dixon. You've got Leroy Dixon. You've got a Gaskins. And they're all living there. And they've all mostly bought this property from Robert Porter, who was flipping land to death. And how did they get the money to be able to buy this land, right? So Leroy Dixon, who bought his land in 1874, he was one of the first to buy land in Merrifield. I found this, that he went under contract in the Freedmen's Bureau. I found this record where he leased 28 acres in Alexandria for $75 a year. And what that lease said was, you can have that acreage, you grow whatever on it to pay off the rental fee, and then whatever's left, you get to keep, right? So my assumption is, whatever he got to keep is what he used to be able to pay off the purchase of the land. Most of these contracts, when you look at it, African Americans that have bought in the Merrifield area, they had like 2 or 3 years to pay off the cost of the land. The land is costing them anywhere from $100, $150 to $300. But they're paying it off. They're not asking anybody for anything, and they're paying it off. A lot of them also are coming from the Alexandria, Freedmen's Village area. Not necessarily where we think Freedman Village is, but there's also partial Freedmen's Village right in Alexandria. And that's where Leroy Dixon and some of my other relatives were living, and then moved up this way. So one thing I found out when you're talking about Freedmen and Reconstruction, what did they want? What did the Freedmen want in Northern Virginia? They wanted to be able to buy land, because land was going to give them this sense of citizenship. They wanted to be educated, because by 1831, the law in Virginia, after Nat Turner's incident, said that you cannot teach any free person or enslaved to read or write, right? Because we're going to keep it down. So they wanted to be educated. And the third thing was they wanted their own religious institutions. They said, we want bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh. We want somebody that understands what we've gone through. We don't want to go to a white church and hear a white minister tell us that we need to be good servants or we need to be good slaves. No, we want our own. So if I tell these stories all the time, if you want to look for African American history, you need to find that church. Because that community is centered around that church. And when I'm doing the Northern Virginia Baptist Association Oral History, 150 churches. Communities are created around these churches, just like in Merrifield. And so I grew up in Merrifield and went to the First Baptist Church of Merrifield, and this is our original church that was built in 1894. And I actually worshiped in this church until we decided to build another church. Now, it didn't have a bathroom, right? It had outhouses, but the good thing was I lived right next to the church, and I had a toilet. So guess what? I never used outhouses. I was really happy about that. But also, you notice when I said Porter Road, in Fairfax County, you always knew where the black communities were. You want to know why? Because all the roads were dirt. And as soon as you hit pavement, you knew you were in the white community. You were in the white section. So these are some of the leaders of the First Baptist Church of Merrifield. Marion Ransel, who is on your left, that's my dad. You've got Clarence Gibson, you've got Reverend C.L. Parker in the center, he baptized me. You've got Reverend Terry. Reverend Terry also was the minister at Albany for a while. You also have Bernard Ransel, who was Fred Ransel's brother. And then in the back, you have Samuel Pearson. And I know some of you may all know Reverend Chester Pearson. Well, Chester Pearson married my mother's sister. So we're sort of related right that way. So this is the Pearson family, because I know that Reverend Pearson was in the Plains, and I should, do you remember the name of the church that he First Baptist, that he pastored? So he also pastored, he pastored, we lived in the Plains, right, exactly. So the Pearsons were another important family in the Northern Virginia area. Why? Because they owned land. And how they got that land was, Francis Hoffer was a white man who owned enslaved people. He also owned Phyllis Pearson, but he owned her in principle, but really that was his considered wife or lover. They weren't legally married because they couldn't be that way. But when he died, he gave all his possessions to Pearson. And so it's from there that Pearson has children, and they created community in the Burke area until the federal government decides they want to build an airport. And so what do? They go straight to the black folks' property. And you will see a consistent thread between eminent domain, taking African Americans' property to build something. And in most cases, or in a lot of cases, they don't build it. So we have here, and again, is Chester Pearson, who was related to Phyllis Pearson. And below that is Leola Lee Pearson, and that was my mother's sister. And they were married, and that's her graduation picture for when she went to Manassas Regional High School. So the First Baptist, the old church was so unique. It was so connected to the community. It was connected to the church. It was connected to the people. It was everything. It was the safety net. It was the middle nucleus of the family and of the community. So inside of it, you'll see on the left-hand side is a picture in the 1960s of our youth choir. The next to it is the church anniversary. The one on the right is a play called Heaven's Gate. And if you notice, there is a head that's turned, like looking in the back on the right-hand side, which is kind of light-skinned. Look at that beauty. And so I know what I'm looking at. But this play was unique. It was so much fun. And they did a lot of these things. And the person that is at the piano is Guy Collins. And Guy Collins was my great uncle. And he was a master pianist, organist. When we went to his house, he had a grandson with a piano, he had a harp, he played for the North Virginia Baptist Association. Everybody knew Guy Collins and his musical talents. And everybody who was related to him had to go learn piano lessons. I didn't want to take piano lessons, I wanted to take ballet. But unfortunately, in the 60s and 70s, there were no black ballet places that you could go to, so I got stuck with taking piano and never really learned how to play. So, First Baptist then decided to build a bigger emphasis, and so they do. So the black and white picture on the left is a picture that I found in the Washington Post, and it's a Merrifield church to be dedicated. And it says it has the worship seats 200, and it contains a fellowship and 5 classrooms. That's for anyone. It didn't say that it had happened. The other picture, black and white, is Reverend Parker and the parishioners walking into the new church. The middle picture is Reverend Parker himself. The other 2 pictures are inside the new church and things that are happening, wedding, a service. So you see the difference between what the old church looked like and what the new church looked like. The interesting thing about the pictures of the old church, nobody has these. Nobody really has seen these. There was one person that I knew. His family came from Marco. And he had these photos. And so me being able to show you these, no one else has these except him. And he's giving me permission to do that. So this is the basement of the church. Now you see that Pepsi machine there, that Coke. Well, when I was growing up, there was a place called not Marshall Hall, it was called Glenada, right? It was a amusement park, but it was segregated. You couldn't go there. But when they desegregated it, they had this special, right? It said if you brought all Pepsi bottle caps on Monday, for every bottle cap you bring, we'll give you a ticket so you can ride. I'm living next to the church, and what's in the basement? A Pepsi machine. Yes, we would go Sunday evening to get Pepsi caps, right, and go get tickets. We would have wads of tickets. We would just have to give them away. So I love this picture because it really talks about our childhood. On the other side, we present a little bit Galleria. Well, I'm living vicariously, I guess, in the church, because here I am for some reason in the church. Don't know why, but here I am. As I said, places were segregated when I was growing up, my parents were growing up. And that segregation meant that we couldn't go to Ocean City. That meant that we couldn't go to Virginia Beach. So where do we go? Every year the church would have their Sunday school outing. That meant we got on a charter bus and we headed somewhere. Usually it would be Wildwood or Atlantic City, or we would go to Annapolis to Sparrows Beach. And Sparrows Beach was owned by 2 sisters, the Carl sisters. One side was Carl's Beach and one side was Sparrows Beach. Sparrows Beach was where the family, Christian folks went to, swim and have activities. Carl's Beach, that's where we went to dance and have a good time. So I was really young, so I didn't get to go to that side of the beach. I just went to this side of the beach where I got stung by a jellyfish, but still, I had a good time. So you'll see in the middle, that's some cousins that are taking pictures on the beach, and on the right, that is my grandfather, A1U. And that Lee name, remember that Lee name, because it's going to come into importance when we start talking about Falkirk County. On the other end, on that left-hand side, because we couldn't go to restaurants, right? When we would go to the country, we would say in Merrifield, let's ride to the country. Okay, let's go to Manassas or Leesburg. We're country. I mean, what are we talking about, right? So we couldn't just go to any restaurant. What did you have to do? You would bring your food. So, African-Americans has this stereotype of oven, fried chicken, and watermelon, and horrible eggs, hard-boiled eggs. Think of the ingenuity, the absolute brilliance of that. Because you can't stop somewhere, you can't stop on the side of the road. You need to take things with you that can be preserved. And so that's what they did, and we enjoyed ourselves going to the country. Now, in there, I have this picture here because I wanted to give you an idea of what the homes look like in Merrifield. And that small child in there is my aunt. Her name is Jeanette Hill. Honestly, she is the griot of our family. And griot or grotto is an African word in storytelling. And so a lot of this information I've gotten from her, and she's passed on to me. So I feel like I'm the family griot there. And the reason why I have this is because in the Washington Bee, which was an African-American paper that was printed in Washington, right, they talk about Merrifield. And they say, here we find quite a lively settlement are people engaged in the usual occupation attended upon agricultural, lighting, church, schools, society, businesses, our status, so on and so forth. And they talk about Mr. C.D. Hyson, who's created a grocery store, and that he has his own horse and wagon. So, we must have been doing pretty good in Merrifield if we got in an article in the Washington News. So I bring that out because we wanted you to see that we're in the paper and the type of homes that are being built on Dallas Road in this Merrifield area. The one sure thing that our church, First Baptist Church of Merrifield, did not have was a cemetery. When they bought the land, the person that sold it to them had bought it from a porter. His name was Robert Bradley. And when he sold it to the church, the land to build the church, he put it in and we could never have a cemetery. Now, I don't know why he did that. Maybe he thought that, somehow we made this land, and if he had to resell it, he would hand him something that they body something, you can't do that. So, maybe that's why he put that provision in there, I don't know. But we didn't have a cemetery, but we did have the Sons and Daughters of Liberty Lodge, which was in Merrifield, and it was a benevolent organization that helped to bury people, helped you if you were sick, so on and so forth. Our family members were part of it. So some of the people in the Pines, which is the next neighborhood or area I'm talking about, donated land, and they created the Sons and Daughters of Liberty Cemetery. And that's where a lot of my ancestors were buried. And that is, do you know where Fairfax Hospital is? It's right across the street from Fairfax Hospital. Right over the road. So, if you notice, the settlements I'm talking about, you've got Merrifield in the Mosaic area on Gallows Road. You go down the road on Gallows to where Fairfax Hospital is. Behind that is the Pines. And if you go diagonally on the other side of Fairfax, that's where Williamstown is. So within, say, a 5-mile radius, you've got these communities, these 3 communities that all fed into the First Baptist Church of Merrifield, and none of them are married. They also had an Oddfellows Hall. So on Gallows Road, this building was the Oddfellows Hall. The interesting thing about this building, it was built in 1917. It later was sold in 1960 for $10 to this man who was Boyd's Piano. He owned Boyd's Piano. And everybody knew the building because he always had this spiked piano up there in the top. But before then, it had been the Oddfellows Hall, another benevolent organization, but it was also an overflow school. Because Merrifield only had one colored school. And like I said, it was one room. My grandma went there, and my mother went there, my mother's brother, Vernon Lee, went there, and I see the sunset back there, that's why I said that. So they all went there. But when it was too crowded, before they built another school, they would use the Oddfellows Hall as an overflow school. This is how cheap Fairfax County was. They also used it as a movie theater. So on weekends, there was somebody who had a projector, and so he would show movies. On weekends, they would pop popcorn, and that's one of the entertainment things. And in the evening, for those people like my mother who only had a 7th grade education, they could take adult ed classes, like learning how to be a cosmetologist or learning how to make furniture if you were a male. So that was the use of this building that was part of this community. Now, this building is no longer there. I wanted to buy it. The guy that owned it said he'd sell it to me for $10 million because I wanted to turn it into a museum. I didn't have $10 million, but evidently somebody else did. And the next thing I know, the building was torn down. That's sad. So the only thing left of the Black community in Merrifield is the church. So just like everything else in the community of Merrifield, it pays poll tax. So this is my father, Freddie Ransel's official poll tax. And you see that he paid his taxes in 1954, 55, 56. And it is now, it is April 57, and he's paying his poll tax. So you can vote. They did have a restaurant in Merrifield, and it was called Harvey's Restaurant. This is a picture of it in the 1960s, but it was opened in the 1940s. Of course, blacks could not go there. But if you were white and you had your dog with you, you could go to the front door and sit there with your dog in you. But if you're black, no. You go to the back and get murdered. So now we're going to go to the Pines, which is the place right behind Fairfax Hospital. So that black outline is where the Pines was. The Pines was about a 40-acre community that African Americans lived in. It is no longer there. It is now Pine Ridge Park. Why? Because in 1966, Fairfax County took the land for eminent domain to build a high school. Guess what? They never built a high school. The most degrading thing they did was there was an organization called Mobil Oil that bought property in the Merrifield area. And when they were digging out the land to put Mobil Oil, it was a swampy area. They always called it Black Marsh. They threw all the dirt on my grandmother's farm. So they never built a school. 20 acres. That property is worth so much money now. And instead of building a school, they gave it to the park authority. And now people are playing soccer on the land that my grandmother and her relatives owned. The blue circle is where most of my grandmother's land was. The white circle is where the cemetery was. And the picture in the middle, that is my grandmother, and that is some of her daughters and her grandchildren. So like I said, the Pines is right across the street from Fairfax County, Iowa. Now, I know it was started in 1960, and if you look at an aerial view of Fairfax Hospital in 1960, it is Fairfax Hospital, nothing but trees. But now, it's a medical complex. So how did we get that property? Well, there was a guy by the name of William Collins, Sr. And William Collins took this picture. It says on the back of the picture, after the Battle of Santiago Bay in 1898, he was a buffalo soldier in the 10th Cavalry. So he was a soldier in the cavalry, and he had gone out west to fight the Indians or whatever. And then when the Spanish-American War broke out, he was part of the battle in Santiago Bay. The thing about him is, he was one of the ones in the 10th Cavalry that went up San Juan Hill. He was one of those black soldiers that helped save Teddy Roosevelt from absolutely getting slaughtered. So do you know what Teddy Roosevelt did to thank those buffalo soldiers? He took a picture. So Teddy Roosevelt's in the middle, and his white Rough Riders are on the right, and the buffalo soldiers, my relative, is on the left. But when the picture gets published, somehow on the left, all those folks are behind. It is just Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, and that's all you hear about. But it is the buffalo soldiers who learned how to fight with Native Americans that helped to save Teddy Roosevelt and those Rough Riders. So it's from that being enlisted in the Spanish-American War that my great-great-grandfather, William Collins, had the money to buy 20 acres of land and start what was called the Pines. He was the original person who cut the road in there to bought the land and created a farm, and other people bought land and then they created a place called the Pines, and they called the Pines place called Pine. And he also told his children, all 5 of them, he said, never sell this land. He said, land makes you rich. That's what you need, generational wealth. He didn't know about that word back then, but we do. And that's exactly what I think Fairfax County did. The way to get, or put African Americans back in their place, is to get rid of that generational wealth. And so what they did was systematically took land from the Burke, took land from the Pines, and so on and so forth. And he is in the middle. The other thing, too, about Spanish American War, people don't know. Merrifield in the Dunmore area was the staging place for training for 22,000 soldiers who then fought in the Spanish-American War. But they had to disassemble the training center because the cholera epidemic broke out in Merrifield, and they started training in other places. But Merrifield, that small forgotten world, had 20,000 plus soldiers training for the military work. So in the center is William Collins Sr. I mean, he's an elderly man. He's in the 1940s, and he's sitting on his farm. He'd been a truck farmer. And what that meant was, and most African Americans in that area, because they were so close to Washington, D.C., they would farm enough food to feed their family, then farm enough to take whatever was left to the markets in Washington, D.C., sell it, come back, they would have commerce to be able to build buildings, to create organizations like Liberty Lodge, Oddfellows Hall, so on and so forth. On the right is Marion Collins Lee, and that's my grandmother. And on the left are the two men on, that's William Collins Sr. William Collins Sr. was the one who came also to live with his son, William Collins Jr. So William Collins Sr. Is the one that has this sort of pipe in his hand, and he fought the Civil War, and his son fought the Spanish-American War. So this is the farm. We've got, actually this is Uncle Vernon holding I think it's a mule, and his sister, Adam Jeanette Hill, running around the field, another cousin that's going sledding, and then two other aunts that are just in the neighborhood in front of their house. So very pictures so you get a sense of what the community was like. So there's a historical marker there. I worked very hard to get this marker because I wanted people to know that there were Black people that lived in that Pines area. So let's talk about James Lee. Well, James Lee, who was born in 1840, was born free. And he was born free in Delaplane in Fauquier County. So imagine that. You know how many miles are between Delaplane and Falls Church, where he lived, where close to where I live? About 40 miles. So remember I told you how roads can have two distances, can have two destinations. So just think, my world began in Delaplane and ended, or start my world that I born into was the Merrifield of Falls Church, but my ancestry starts in the Fauquier County area. The interesting thing about James Lee, because he was born free, he didn't register. So every 3 years, the law said if you were a free person of color, you had to go to the courthouse and get your free papers. So James Lee and his grandmother and his mother, in September of 1840, came to the courthouse here in Warrenton and got their free papers. How do I know they were free? Well, I'm going to tell you. If you haven't gone to the Afro-American Museum that Miss Karen White Hughes has, you are missing out. Or, I'm sorry, Karen White, I'm sorry. Because she is the one that found these loose papers in the courthouse of the Free Negro Registry. And without her putting those together in a compilation, we would not know this history. So much of what I'm going to tell you about James Lee, I have found through Ms. Hughes, Ms. White, and also another cousin that's over here. And so I'm glad to see him here too. So it's been like this combination of trying to find it, but I applaud you. Thank you so much for helping me with this. So that is him, James Lee. He's 5 months old, and his brother Charles Lee. Betsy Ann Lee was his mother. She was born free in 1823. So she's registering with her brother Squire Lee, James Jackson Lee. This is James Lee's grandmother. Now, James Lee's grandmother was Lucy Lee. At the time of this, she was 40 years old. She was born around 1800. And she was born free. So how do you get born free? Well, the law says that if you're born free, if your mother's free when you're born, then you're born free. If your mother is enslaved, you're enslaved. So somehow Lucy Lee, born 1800, had a mother who got manumitted. I don't believe she was born free. I think she was manumitted through Robert Harmon III, who had over 400 slaves, and he gave manumission to those slaves. how I think Lucy Lee was born free, and when she had Betsy born free, and Betsy had James. So we're seeing 4 generations of African Americans who were born free, living in Delaware, right here in Faulkner County. This is what Charles Lee's free papers look like. And if you think about a free paper, it's like a driver's license, right? You need to have that with you. The other thing is, you're not going to go very far where white people don't know you. It's not going to be, well, there's some land down in North Carolina you need to buy. White folks don't know that you're free. It's just like 12 years of slave. They didn't know in Washington, D.C. that he was free. They took his papers. Nobody's going to believe him, so they sell him into slavery. So African Americans are going to group together and stay close together and help each other because whites here in Faulkner County know who's free and who's not. The 18th census, and that's a good place to look to see where people are. We find Lucy Lee. She is living in the southwest district in Faulkner County, and she's 60 years old. Her grandson, James Lee, Charles Lee, and Lucy Ann Lee are all living with her. And in that census, this is the 1860 census, it says that she's a farmhand, and she is, her real estate is valued at $100, and her personal property is valued at $50. And she's living around other African Americans, which we're going to do a bigger study on because we believe that there was a large community there. But think about it, in 1860, you have an African American woman who's born free, in the census has real estate valued at $100 and personal property at $50. So in 1860, there were about 21,000 people in Faulkner County, 52% were black. 821 of the 11,276 blacks were free. And this is from Eugene Shields, who has done an incredible amount of work documenting African American communities. So, where were Charles and James in 1861? Right? The war breaks out, and white folks really want to know, where are the African Americans who are free living? Because we've got to keep an eye on them. So they made a registry, which I found at the museum, the Afro-American Museum. And you see where the arrows point, that's James Lee and Charles Lee. And they were living on Andrew Chung's farm or plantation. So evidently, we would assume that Lucy Lee has purchased or is purchasing or renting property from Andrew Chung, which is in the Delaware area. So why did they make this list of where these three people, these three African Americans were? In the time of the Civil War, in July of 1861, the Confederacy made a law called the Public Service Act. And what that said was any free African American or enslaved person could be conscripted into the Confederacy and forced to work for them. They're not going to give them a gun. They're not going to, they're going to make them do manual labor. And I think that's where people get confused when they say, oh, there were African Americans in the Confederacy. They were conscripted against their will, I would say, 99.9% of the time, and forced to do manual labor. If you see this list, this is a letter that was written in 1861, October 13, 1861. It's right before the winter campaign, after the first Battle of Manassas, for Centerville, Virginia. And the marshal in Faulkner County has sent a letter out there to the Delaware area and says, I want you to get 100 free Negroes that have shoes, blankets, good minds, and I want you to take them down to Centerville. And I want you to have them dig entrenchments for the winter in there. And James Lee's name is number 33. So we know that James Lee is coming during the Civil War. We follow his route. He's coming from Delaware off Andrew Chung's farm, coming down into Centerville, and eventually, after the Civil War, he makes his home in Faulkner, Virginia. So after the war, the reason we think that Lucy Lee really had tried to own this $100 worth of personal property or real estate is because this is found, and it says that James Lee wishes to obtain title and possession of house and land which he and his brother bought of A.J. Shunk in Faulkner County. They never got the land, right? They were petitioning to the Southern Commission. A lot of African Americans and other people would petition to say, oh, you know, the Union or the Confederacy stole my horse, I need reimbursement for it. Well, now, James and Charles are going before them and asking for the land that was presumably their grandmother's and then theirs, but they're not given title to this property. James Lee writes this statement in 1923, so we know that now he and Charles do not get possession of this land in Faulkner County, so they come to Falls Church. And he talks about when he came to Falls Church, how the railroad ties were all bent around the trees and how disruptive this was. But he's also talking about starting churches and going to church and finding his religion. So there again, this is some of the importance of the African American community reconstruction and coast. You know, buying that land, having a religious institution, and being able to get educated. So by 1867, in Falls Church, James and Charles purchased 8 acres in 1867 from General John S. Crocker, another Union officer that bought a lot of land in Fairfax County and flipped it just like Robert Porter to African Americans. They paid $32 to $35 per acre. In 1870 census, there were 120 blacks that owned land in Fairfax County. James and Charles sold produce to Falls Church residents and or markets in D.C. And James was the winner of the Falls Church Best Garden Award. So they would have this award of all the homes in Falls Church, including white homes. And his land always won the best for gardening. So by 1882, on his personal property tax, he owns 2 horses at value of $65, 2 cows at $30, 3 hogs, a carriage, clock, sewing machine, and furniture. Think about this. This is a man who came from Faulkner County, right? And he comes down to Falls Church. He owns property now, and he's got a clock, so he's telling time. He's got a sewing machine, so his wife must be sewing. And then he's got a carriage. And oral history says that James Lee had a white horse and a carriage. And what he would do is he would rent it out for weddings. So people who could afford it would rent his, carriage and horse, and he would do, whatever, like we're doing now for weddings. So he was seeming to be an entrepreneur. He was a farmer and also had a stock business of a carriage or horse and weddings. He also was the first trustee of the Second Baptist Church in Falls Church. So there again, we go back to how important the churches are. And this is a picture of the original church that was built. Not only were churches integral into the community for religious purposes, but it was also for education. If there was no school already near the area, the churches then were used as schools until they built a school. And that's where Second Baptist was used. Now this is an interesting thing. In July 25th, 1888, James Lee writes, Mr. and Mrs. Lee are willing for Mr. Arthur Woody to have their Betsy Lee, as I am so busy that I could not come. Mr. and Mrs. James Lee. So he's given a handwritten permission that his daughter Betsy, named after his mother, right, can get married. So I find that so interesting because here these are his words. Now whether he wrote that or not, I don't know, because it does say that he, right after the war he was illiterate, but he could have gone to school and learned how to do it right. I don't know. So James Lee had a son named Arthur, and that's his picture, and that's my great-great-grandfather. And then the top picture is Arthur Lee, who was my grandfather, and that is his sister. That's his sister. And I put this picture on there because she's got a mink coat. She was so proud of that mink coat. She was like the only person around that had a mink coat because she worked in I think he was a senator or House of Representatives. She was like his personal maid in his house. So when his wife got a building code, she got the old one. James Lee, just like a lot of landowners, donated land in Falls Church to create the Falls Church Negro School. Now this one was a two-room schoolhouse. It did not have indoor plumbing. It had a privy, you had to do the wood-burning stove. But he did, like any good landowner in that area, donated land for the school. My mom and Uncle Bert and her sister Hazel and Myra all started at that school in Falls Church, and then they moved to the Pines, and that is done. My mother is the second on the left, in the middle is Vernon, and on the end is her other sister. Now, so where did the African-American students go? Because in Merrifield, they did not have a real school sanctioned by Fairfax County until 1897. And so where did they go to school? They went from Merrifield to Falls Church. They went to the Falls Church, James Lee's property, and he created the school to go to school. And we know that from the 1890 College School Registry, you've got folks from the Pines registering their kids into the Falls Church School because there is no African-American school in Merrifield. Then they created an African-American school in Merrifield in 1879. The picture on your left, the top is the students in the 1920s. On the bottom is the one-room schoolhouse that my mother and my grandmother went to. And the other picture of that people are rolling on the tricycle, that's me. In the foreground with the red circle, that is the school. So I grew up in front of the one-room schoolhouse that my mother went to. And I used to play in that school because they then sold the property and rented the school out as a house. The interesting thing, I went back to Washington, D.C. because I love newspapers, you find a lot. They had an end-of-year exercise for that school, and it's dated May 26, 1917. And some of the graduates in that school, if you look at the paragraph on your right, it has in there Myra Collins, that is my grandmother, and they also have in there Freddie Ransel, who was my father. So it's so interesting to find an article that has your father and your grandmother going to the one-room schoolhouse that you grew up across the street from this home to. Now, Fairfax County had this one-room schoolhouse forever. The people in Fairfax County were absolutely upset at the African Americans, and they wanted another school. So what they did was they built two schools, one for African Americans and one for blacks. So in Dunmore, the nice brick building on the right is the one for the whites. It had an auditorium, it had janitorial service, the whole 9 yards. They spent $50,000 on this one. The one on the left is a two-room schoolhouse right down the street from the one-room schoolhouse. They spent $5,000 on that. So you see the disparity. But in 1948, James Lee and his died and his relatives donate land again. And they create the James Lee Elementary School. This school had an auditorium, had janitorial service, had the things that the other schools had, but this was really the only black elementary school in the Merrifield Falls Church area. So that's another picture of James Lee, and that's a picture of the Falls Church Common School in the background, the land that James Lee donated. And in the foreground is the land his relatives donated to create the James Lee Community Center, which is down at the elementary school. So where did the kids go that did not were able to get a high school education? Well, in my mother's case, no place. But her younger sisters, they went to the Manassas Industrial School for Colored Youth that was started by Jenny Dean in 1894. And guess who opened the school? I'm getting a brain fog here. Frederick Douglass came from Washington, D.C. on the train to Manassas to help open up the Manassas Industrial School for Colored Youth. But by 1938, the school is no longer an industrial school. Prince William County has bought it as a high school. Fairfax County then buys into it and creates a regional high school for Manassas students. So So if you lived in Mount Vernon, if you lived in Prince William County, if you lived in Rappahannock, Wade County, any of those, you went to this one school, Manassas Regional High School. It took my mother's sisters 2 hours to get to school and 2 hours to get back. And you know who was driving the buses? Students. The other thing that people don't know about Jenny Dean, when she opened up the Manassas Industrial School, she also had a hospital. And if you look at that article, it was called the Berlin Hospital, and it wasn't just for the students, but it was for the community. So I want to learn more about that and how the health issues were related and were taken care of in that Manassas area for not only students, but the community. And that is a picture of Jenny Dean. So that's a picture of Merrifield. She was that little girl that was in front of the house in Merrifield. Now she's a young lady, and that is her homecoming picture for the Manassas Regional High School. And the top right is her sister, and the bench seat for buses, that's the type of buses they had. So they didn't have individual seats, they were benches and they faced each other. And of course it was second. Then they opened up in 1954 Luther Jackson High School. It was the only black high school in Fairfax County, and everybody went to this one school. And they were very proud of that school. And the teachers were all black, and they cared about the students, and they pushed them to excellence. In 1955, when Luther Jackson first opened, it was grade 1 through 12. But then it changed to just being a high school 7 through 12. But in 1959, after 1955, I had cousins that also went to James Lee because they were in elementary school. And this is their picture. The arrows are a couple of my cousins that are studying in class. The other area that we talk about is Williamstown. And Williamstown was created by a Fauquier County resident, Seth Williams. And Seth came down to the Merrifield area, and he bought land, and he got to be a farmer, and he was very successful truck farming. But then, in around the 1920s, 1930s, once again, the federal government decided they need to build the Pentagon. So whose land did they take? You got it. So where did those folks go? They come to the Merrifield area, and they buy land from Seth Williams, who was a Fauquier County resident. And Seth Williams is in the middle, and his wife is on the other side. When they took my grandmother's property in the 1960s, there wasn't any place that she could go, right? Unless she went to a black community. So the only other place was to buy land in Williamstown with Seth Williams. So this is the house that they bought in the 1960s, away from the property that her father had given her as a buffalo soldier. I'm telling you, my grandmother went to her grave with a broken heart because she had to give that land over to the county. And she would pass by that land, and every time she did, she cried. Because she made a promise to her father, who had been a buffalo soldier, not to sell that land, and she had to lose it. Just like the people in Willard, who African Americans lost their land so they could build Dulles Airport. So this is a whole systematic way of keeping African Americans away from generational wealth. These are some of the other houses in Williamstown. Now, the community is no longer there. Why? And neither is Merrifield. Because in the 1960s, with desegregation, Fairfax County decided, well, you know what, all these black communities are white. They're disgusting. So we're going to pass all these sanitation laws that says you have to have indoor plumbing, and you have to have paved roads and sidewalks and street lights. African Americans could not afford those, although most of the African Americans in this area are working in government jobs. Leslie Lee back here, his father was Vernon Lee, my mother's brother, and he ran the nursery at Arlington Cemetery. As a matter of fact, Leslie was there when they buried John F. Kennedy. He went to the burial because his father was there. And so they made all these restrictions about segregation, about sanitation and life, knowing African Americans could not meet that. the African Americans would go to the banks and say, we need to get money because we've got to get your plumbing, we've got to get pavement, and the banks would say, well, no, we can't do that because you don't have any more plumbing, and we're going to need you for collateral because, the county says that your house is blight. So then there was this catch-22, and they could not get what they needed. So in comes the developers, right? They're like, we'll buy your land, and you can now move to the white sections where they have lights, where they have roads that are paved. So here, they buy land cheap from African Americans. The African Americans in Williamstown moved to Sterling. The African Americans in Merrifield moved to Arlington, and then these communities are gone. So now they're not there. The only thing that's really left of these three communities is the First Baptist Church of Merrifield. And so that's why I wrote this book, because I want people to know about those communities, the people that live there, the struggles they had to go through, and the connection, especially of James Lee and the Fauquier County area. These are some of the families that lived in Williamstown, and this is my grandmother's house in 1965, before she had to sell it, or it was taken by the military. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I started doing this because my grandmother, I think my grandmother's listened to all the stories that she could tell me. She told me about her grandmother who'd been enslaved and lived in a cabin with a dirt floor, and when the rain came, it would come through the wood, because there was no knob in the cabin, and the water would make dirt on the floor, and that's what they lived in. And she, cooked in a one pot and so on and so forth. And in the fourth grade, in Fairfax County, had to write an essay about Virginia history, so I wrote about my history. It was my first oral history project. And I went to school and I told my teacher, I said, I'm going to I've never, miss a mic. I want to be the first person to get up and talk about my essay. And she said, well, that's it, don't. I said, it's about my ancestors that were enslaved. And she turned black and white. And you know what I got to read my essay? Like the bell was getting ready to ring, the kids were putting on their clothes. I was the last one to be able to read. So I gave a promise to my grandmother to myself. I said, if I get people in an auditorium, I'm going to lock the door and make sure they listen to every word I say about my relatives. So here you go. We can unlock the doors now.
Could you go back to the slide that showed the list of the families, what they're including in?
Yeah.
Okay. That's his information name.
Yeah, I went to school with most of these people. William Mills, who was my godfather, and went to school with the Poway children, the Whitleys, the Ruffers. So this is a generational community. First, second, third generation.
Just to check on that, were these families also families that associated with the same names in the Loudoun County?
Yes, some of them are. Absolutely. Yeah, if you look at that.
Yes, that's what I recognize.
Lansdowne, absolutely. So all these communities are connected. Yes, they really are connected. And one of the things that is really interesting that I've found from my research is the racetracks that were around here and the part of horse culture in the Fauquier and Leesburg area. And even in Manassas, I found the colored Manassas racetrack that no one knew about, and that Prince County wanted to hide. It's underneath of a data center. And it was owned by an African American, and it was very prominent. As a matter of fact, there's an article that says James Lee went to the horse race in September. Why would that be so notable? James Lee has been driven by his daughter, one, their car, two, he's going to the horse show because it is a prominent place to go, and he always had it on every weekend. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, I appreciate you telling the whole story, but also highlighting what the ratio of culture and people looks like. It's subtle, it's political, and it's usually things you can't control. But this is the ratio of people, and places that live in history, if you're bringing that back, which is great. And also making us aware of how suddenly the view of racial starts to happen.
And they're trying to do that now.
Taking history, taking the land, condemning property, they're always still racial.
I asked my professor at George Mason, Professor Crew, I said, what are we going to do about them trying to get rid of all of our Black history? He said, they can't get rid of it. If it's in here,
Exactly.
you can't get rid of it. You know, even if I don't have this book, I can get up and talk to you, and I can tell you, and each one of you have a story about your family. Don't let those stories die. And as an oral historian, that's what I do. I go and I talk to your family and say, tell me about it. And that history is captured. Yes, sir.
In 1956, my parents went out to the army, and it was, I guess it was about a black community, and there was a wall between our community and the black community, like,
Is that still there?
we could drive over it, but something else is when I got in the 1990s, I had some house, so I had this title out there, and in there, in that picture, I didn't look at this most, there was a document in there that my dad and mom had signed in 1956, and it said, you had to guarantee that you would never sell to a black person or a Jew. Now, I guess, I don't know, sometimes it was 60, maybe 61, something like that, I'm not sure exactly the time. Or literally all regular, black families. And it was interesting because I ended up selling the house to that lady in the next door. Because I wanted to put out this sell the house, I went around the community and I said, this is what's going to happen, and maybe people are coming next door, this is what they know. And she said, oh, I was like, talk about it. Okay, it seems to fine. But we got to talk with this, because we moved in this neighborhood back in the 60s. Your family was the only family in the neighborhood that would talk to us, and they actually invited us to this for dinner. I don't think that's probably what you say, but
Well, that community is called Hallsville. You know, first up, Hallsville. The north side of Arlington is Hallsville. The south side is called Green Valley. And so there was this demarcation between white and black. And now guess what? The black community is now a white community. The black community is now 10% black and 90% white. How is that? Well, because the price of housing in Arlington is ridiculous. Like Delray, that's a black community. So you go into the black community, you've got people who die, their children are trying to sell the property, they sell the property cheaper than if you go to the white community. You build an extension or a great grandiose house, and that's how you create another community. And they also are trying very hard to get rid of many of the iconic things that they had in North Arlington. Like on Thanksgiving, they had the Turkey Bowl, where all the black people come out and they play tackle football with no heads. Don't ask me why, but they do. But the community there now that is white doesn't want them to do that. Even though the park that they used was given by a black man because it was segregation back then, and the only place that blacks could go was this land that he donated as a park. So now the Afro-Americans that are left are trying to fight to say, look, we're not going to get rid of this. So we have to continue this battle to keep not only our land, but our culture and things that are very important to us, like the Turkey Bowl. Thank you for that. And a lot of those African-Americans from Merrifield moved to that Arlington area. Yes, sir.
well, it's a question. My first one that happened, it was really like $40,000 was a lot of money. You know, I sold it in the 90s. The whole people that are there, they can't understand it. Even if they own that house outright, they can't afford to pay the taxes.
The property I grew up in Merrifield, we sold for $185,000, which we thought was a pretty good price, right, for an acre of land. So Merrifield Garden Center bought it. And the church next to us decided they wanted the property next year. Merrifield Garden Center turned around and sold it to them for $4 million.
That's never right before the God
And you know, we wanted the church to buy it in the first place. And they said that we were trying to beat that $185,000. But then they had to turn around and pay $4 million. Yes, sir.
Well, first off, like the time, we always connected, and I was told for 30 years when I came home from Greenville, my very young lived in D.C. The first time I heard of Williamstown, she said, you know where the U.S. is, that's how people are. I'm like, wow. Well, I was in South Williams, coming out of Coffee Canyon, this is where it's Catholic. My great grandmother family was raised.
So your kids were Williams, that's awesome. Yeah. His house was one of the ones that was on there. He was a wonderful man. He was the sexton at First Baptist Church in Merrifield. He helped build half of the old church. He was an excellent builder. And when he would sell people property, he would help them build their house. That's what a good person is.
My cousin said he had some money with me, which got out of so.
Okay.
He didn't want to do it.
Well, he's in the books. So I'm still doing more research on, I'd love to talk to you more about, so I get more information about Williamstown area. I went to school with most of the kids that were there.
My father told me when he played Williamstown when he was there at football game. He was actually, I've been there, I know where.
Yeah.
I didn't know all the other times or the other spot because it's all the open.
Right, and it's lived down there. Their best counties playing for us. Yes, sir.
Now, I was he was 30 years old, and we lived in Hall. That is, this is one of my family. And his grandfather came to Holland to have a study. He gave with his father, and his father was a pastor. But I never found out whether pastor was also a slave at the time that the kids But he was, when they came to that young college, I learned that they come from 12 years. And you have something up there about 3 slaves, this is slaves that were free. And that was I think the rest of that 1961, or 1861. And that would have been Harvard, and was exactly really the time that they were going. So that was something that I didn't know, but I took the chance to find out. Because on that list, the thing is, these years ago, he was asking, his name was Ashley, which is
They always do a lot of mistakes. So you have to kind of figure it out. You may want to go to the museum because here's a museum is a perfect repository to find this type of information. I think a lot of it is on the internet. They aren't digitized, so you may want to go.
But I never thought to ask that. To ask that question.
I do have books to sell, and they're not even one.
Hello, Marion. How you doing?
I'm fine.
This is a good presentation. I enjoyed it. I want to know one thing. The connection with the Bradleys and Lees. I can't remember who or how who was married into one. That's what I want to find out. I can't remember. Like Leonard Bradley. Excuse me.
Avon Lee's sister.
That's
Mary
right.
Bradley.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because we're trying to find, well, Leonard
Her name
Bradley.
was Hazel Lee Bradley, one of the Minka Hazel Lee Bradley.
Right.
And she married Bradley.
She married, right. Exactly.
And the Bradleys bought a lot of property from Porter.
Right. And that was a false soldier.
Yeah. He was quite young. Yes, sir.
Two things. I have a book on comparison investment. I'm going to go back and look. See my piece. Go back and look at the term and it says public service. And the other thing was the farming practice for people who grow food out here. Truck farming. That's what my grandfather did. When he retired from the post office, you see that farm. And we go all road was like the way it's done in the Loudon time.
Yeah.
And he was bring this to DC, he would buy a rig, how you can bring out here to the farms for all of that.
This area, when I say this area, I'm talking North Virginia, because it's a breadbasket so close to Washington, D.C., where the big markets are, there really was a lot of commerce. And like William Collins considered his truck farming his business. Like Saturday he'd sell, Sunday he'd go to church, Monday he's getting the books and the ledgers, and he's figuring out what he's going to take on Saturday to the farm. And in the winter, they cut down pine trees and take them to Georgetown and sell them to rich people or, Reese or whatever. So there was this entrepreneurship. They didn't ask anyone for anything.
My wife told me like that, you want to stay with your grandfather? She said, no, we just grandfather. I said, no, that's how they get over the income stream. Both income stream. And never like this. So I'm going to
Because people think that Africans, when they came over to the United States from Africa, had to be taught how to farm. No, they already knew how to farm. They were teaching South Carolinians how to grow rice. So it shouldn't surprise you to see that they were such entrepreneurs with their farms. Because they knew.
It's the same form that you mentioned in Congress. There was a John Paul who's actually speaking.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And she didn't forget that.
Well,